Hello, welcome for this new video on the Vijnana Bhairav Tantra. We are in a series of practices of awakening, bearing on pleasure and bliss in all of its shades. And today we will see 3 verses that point at awakening through sexual pleasure. But before delving into them, I would like to go back a little to a quote given by the commentator Ānanda to the previous verse, the 66, about the feeling of an ant on the skin, sprawling on the skin, very subtle feeling. That image is an image of subtle tactile sensation. And that tactile sensation is a path or is a pointer to pure awareness, to pure bliss even. And that's what says a very beautiful quote given here in Ānanda's commentary that I would like to share with you. First in Sanskrit. Pipilika sparshamatrat prathate paramam sukham. Just from the feeling of an ant, pipilika, just from that subtle skin feel, the supreme pleasure spreads, arises, manifests, becomes manifest. Prathate, spreads out. Matrat, just from that, just from listening or projecting, putting all of one's attention into the sensation of touch, into the tactile sensation, here called the sensation like an ant sprawling on your skin. Just from that supreme pleasure, not just pleasure, but supreme pleasure spreads, manifests, arises. Just through that practice, says Ānanda, antarmukharamo bhavati, one comes to rest, turned inward, turned towards inward bliss, the bliss that is the self, the bliss that is consciousness, the bliss that is our true nature. So let's continue with bliss, with that verse 68 about awakening through sexual pleasure. First in Sanskrit. Om vahner viṣasya madhye tu cittaṃ sukhamayaṃ kṣipet kevalaṃ vāyupūrṇaṃ va smarānandena yujyate. So one should throw one's attention, cittaṃ here stands for attention, the mind as attention, not the mind as the totality of habits, of vasanas and sanskaras, as it would be usually, but here it means more precisely attention. And one should throw one's attention sukhamayaṃ, overflowing with pleasure, with sexual pleasure. Madhye, in the interval, in the middle, in between. Vahner viṣasya, between fire and poison. So here there are several interpretations. We have a quite detailed commentary and that practice, again, just like the verse, bring us back to the practice of breath, listening, observing breath. I just finished with the translation of the verse itself. So one should project one's attention filled with bliss in between fire and poison. We're going to see what it is. It's very simple. Kevalaṃ va, either as a stand-alone practice, just that, kevalaṃ, just that, vāyupūrṇaṃ va, or filled with breath. So filled with breath and smarānandena, through that bliss of eros, of sexual pleasure, through that bliss of sexual pleasure, smara is eros, is kamadeva, the god of love. Yujyate, one reaches the state of yoga, that is, of union of the individual with the divine, according to the classical definition of yoga that we find in the tantras, in the Shaiva tantras. So one should project one's attention filled with bliss in between fire and poison. What does that mean? What is fire? What is poison? Well, here several interpretations are given. Not always clear, but there is one quote which identifies those places, those fire and poison, as places of the subtle body. And fire, Bhakni, would be a place just above the anal region and below the navel region zone. Nabhyado angulanam chatushtaye. So it would be 4 finger widths below the navel. And Visha itself would be the spot of the genitals. So what is meant here is that at the moment during sexual pleasure, you concentrate your attention on the very place where you feel the most sexual pleasure. It's quite clear, in fact. It is expressed in symbolic terms, in a kind of jargon, but the meaning still is quite clear. Kevalaṃ vāyupūrṇaṃ va, or just filled with wind, prana shaktiṃ. Prana shaktiṃ, says Shivopadhyaya. So this is not so clear, but I think that we might have a clue in chapter 6 of the Tantra Loka. I was speaking of it. I said a word of it last time in the previous video. In that chapter 6 of his Tantra Loka, where he explains some aspects of sexual practice and breath practice at the same time, because both are related to the central channel starting from the heart. The breath practice is from the heart to the end of 12 above the head, and the sexual practice is from the heart to the end of 12, which is below or in front or outside anyway of the genital organs, so that the subtle body is symmetrical with a center in the heart and with two sides projecting, one upward, one downward. Upward is for the practice of breath, so it would be here alluded by the expression vāyupūrṇaṃ, or filled with breath. That would be the yogic practice practiced alone. And there is the practice, the sexual practice, which is from the heart to the end of 12, below the sexual organs. In both cases, the practice, or one aspect of the practice, or one level of the practice, is to follow the exhalation, the out-breath from the heart to the end of, to the ultimate limit, the end of it, in the space above the head. And in the case of sexual practice, it is to follow the movement of the seminal fluid, the sexual energy, starting from the heart, which in every case is the source of all movements, which is pure consciousness, and up to the moment of orgasm, the end of it again, outside of the body again. So the two movements of out-breath and seminal discharge, they are two symmetrical movements, one above and one below. But the practice is the same in both cases. The number of chakras through which it passes is the same. They are not the same chakras, but the number is the same. It's 6 chakras starting from the heart in every case. And so maybe I would do one day a more detailed video about this. But as always, those details are not so interesting and not so important. Here, what is said is just, during sexual union, if you throw all your attention in sexual pleasure, it will lead you to absolute, divine, spiritual pleasure. It is as simple as that. So the second commentary by Ānanda, which is earlier, more ancient than Shivopadhyaya, confirms that interpretation that vāyupūrṇaṃ alludes to pranayama practice. He says, Athava vāyupūrṇaṃ kevalaṃ pranayama varjitamapi. So it would be a kind of spontaneous pranayama, without deliberate practice, without deliberate manipulation, just observing the breath, which is exactly the practice described in chapter 6 and most often in Kevalaṃ teachings. And how sexual pleasure leads to absolute pleasure, according to Ānanda, it is because kamanande, in the sexual pleasure, sarva viṣaya vismarake, one forgets all other objects. There is a forgetting of duality. Sarva viṣaya vismaranat. Well, it is not 100% clear when you look in their explanations. Maybe because those commentators were living in a time when those practices were completely rejected, even within the inner circles. You know, at that time, in the 17th, 18th century, Islam had invaded Kashmir for already many centuries. Few Hindu Brahmin families were remaining, even though one cannot say how many, but it was probably a minority. So they were oppressed by Muslim, and because of that oppression, the competition within the Hindu communities about purity and following the rules of orthodoxy has probably increased. That is, the pressure they got from the outside increased, translated as a social pressure within the community. And it is very probable that those practices, the sexual practices, were not seen in a very good light. Even though here there is no question of transgressing any taboo. It's not there. It's just sexual pleasure. It can be with your spouse, with your wife, with your legal wife, with your orthodox wife or husband. And there is nothing essentially transgressive here. But I think that that pressure came to a point where it became Puritanism, and so it was no longer possible, conceivable, to speak clearly about those things. Just like nowadays, if you speak to any Hindu about those things, he will never answer clearly. Even if you show him or her a very clear description of those practices, he will never feel easy about it. He will never speak easily about it. So anyway, the practice itself is clear. In that verse, it is said, sexual pleasure is an occasion for awakening. Period. Verse 69. Om Shakti Sangama Sangshuddha śaktyabhāve shavasānikam yat sukham brahmatattvasya tat sukham svākyam ucyate. So that pleasure, yat sukham, that pleasure which by which one is invaded, possessed, penetrated, avesha, at the occasion of asanikam, Shakti, when the power, when one's sexual power, but power, just like life power, vital power, Sangshuddha is excited, Sangama, by the union, the sexual union, Shakti, with a power, that is, with a woman, so that pleasure one feels deeply, one gets absorbed into when one's vital power is excited by the union with a woman. That pleasure, brahmatattvasya, is the pleasure of the absolute, of the ever-expanding one, Brahman, of the ever-expanding one. That sukham, that pleasure, svākyam ucyate, is said to belong to the self. So what is said here is that, again, sexual pleasure is absolute pleasure, is divine pleasure, is spiritual pleasure. It is an occasion for that recognition to take place. Here it is a matter of recognition. Sexual pleasure is there. Divine pleasure is far away. So what I have to do is to recognize one into the other. I have to recognize divine pleasure in sexual pleasure. Here it is a practice of recognition. So it is in fact the same practice as in the previous verse, but described with different words and probably coming from a different source. Well, here again, the commentary is not very clear. The commentators do not feel very comfortable with those topics, and they just quote a verse or pieces of verse that come, I think, from the Upanishad, a line that compares the sexual union, the bliss of sexual union, with the bliss of spiritual union. It's very clear, straightforward, that just like in sexual pleasure, in spiritual pleasure, you forget everything. It's a bliss where you forget everything. Na bāhyam veda nantaram. You don't know outside, you don't know inside. So there is no more any duality. There is no more any separation between me and other, between inside and outside. So there is no duality. So it's an occasion for awakening. And usually people do not awaken through it. They are not spiritually nourished by it because they are not aware of that very possibility. They take sexual pleasure as just sexual pleasure. They don't connect between sexual pleasure and divine spiritual pleasure, though the connection is potentially there. So what is called for here is a recognition, recognizing the one in the other, recognizing something which is held to be very highly spiritual but very far away, divine pleasure, into something which is very intimate, but which is believed to be very ordinary and even impure in all religions. Anyway, verse. So of course there is a quote which says that this is only an example, and only the fools take it literally, and this is not an injunction and to enjoin to sexual pleasure. But it does not feel right. I think here it's not just an example. Why just an example? It's a practice. Verse 70. Om lehanāmanthanākoṭaiḥ strīsukhasya bharāt smṛteḥ śaktyabhāve deveśi bhaved ānandasamplavaḥ. So, deveśi, O mistress of the gods, śaktyabhāve, even when there is no woman, no Shakti, bharāt smṛteḥ, just by remembering with full strength of memory, strīsukhasya, just by remembering with full strength the pleasure one had with the woman, with that woman, koṭaiḥ, through thousands, myriads of lehana, licking, manthana, and moving, sexual moving, genital moving. Here it means like, basically it means to churning, but here in the sexual sense, in sexual type of churning. Bhaved ānandasamplavaḥ, one will be drowned in bliss. One will be drawn in bliss just through remembering fully the bliss, the sexual pleasure one had with a woman, through licking and churning, etc. One will get fully drowned, merged into bliss, into sexual bliss, ānanda, into sexual bliss. So here again the same practice, but only through memory, the power of memory. The power of memory is very great, and it is held in very high esteem in the pratyabhijna tradition, philosophical tradition, which is part of Kashmir Shaivism, of Tantric Shaivism. And in that philosophical tradition, they say that smriti, memory, is a chintamani, is a philosopher's stone, is a wish-fulfilling jewel, a magical stone, if you will. That through memory one can realize one's true nature, because through memory one experiences one's freedom from time. One can go back in time. And Pratyabhijna philosophers do not agree that memory is just an illusion, that it is just a fake experience. No, they say that it's just a matter of the power of memory. But if memory is strong enough, is powerful enough, if desire is strong enough, then a memory is just like a direct present perception. Bharāt smṛteḥ. So just when memory has its full strength, then it is just as good as a direct present experience. And last but not least, here of course in all those practices they speak from the point of view of man, because usually, even though those tantric traditions, kevalaṃ traditions, speak of women as goddesses, usually still the practice is aimed at male practitioners almost all the time. There are a few exceptions. Where it is mentioned by Abhinavgupta, for example, in chapter 29 of Tantra, that women will get more and faster through sexual practice than men. But most of the time, those practices, when they are described and enjoined, are described and enjoined from the point of view of men, even though we are quite sure and certain that the practice was done by both men and women. But still, most of the tantric traditions are dominated by males. There is one exception, the Kalikrama Mahānaya tradition, which has been revealed by a woman. And also there is the Pichumata Brahmayamala Tantra, a huge tantric cycle of revelations that has been revealed. The Tantra itself tells us that has been revealed by a woman, if my memory is good. But most often everything is described and enjoined from the point of view of a man. Well, that's it for the sexual practices here in that tantra. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.